I'm going to be talking about, I'm a child psychiatrist, and I'm going to be talking about psychopathology, but towards the end, I'm going to flip it, and instead of talking about psychopathology, I'm going to talk about competence, because we have become interested over time in understanding how some children, despite being exposed to severe early deprivation, manage to have outcomes where they're functioning competently compared to their age mates. So those are the two things that I'm going to be talking about. So here's our plan. First, I will talk about mental health outcomes following the conclusion of the randomized trial. Just mentioned a bit about that. Then I'll talk about a follow-up that we conducted when the children were 12 years of age. And then I'll talk about an outcome that we conducted when the children were 16 years of age, which has only recently been completed. And then I will talk about some of the factors that reduce mental health problems along the way. And then finally, talk about competence, as I said. Okay, so this is just to remind you of our design, where we began with 187 children. We screened them down to 136. They ranged in age from 6 to 30 months. They were comprehensively assessed and then randomized to care as usual or to foster care that Chuck described. There was also a group of typically developing, never institutionalized Romanian children. And the reason why we included that group is because we were using assessments that had never been used in Romania before, and we wanted to see how do typically developing children perform on those measures. So we assess the children for follow-ups at 30 months, at 42 months, and at 54 months. That was the conclusion of the randomized control trial. That was the final outcome. At that point, as you heard yesterday, at that point, we turned the foster care network that we had created over to the local governmental authorities in Romania, and they began to assume management and control over those foster homes and foster parents. So the trial ended, but we were still interested in conducting follow-ups, and we conducted follow-ups when the children were 8, 12, and 16 years. And as Nathan said earlier, we're planning to conduct a follow-up when the children are 21 years of age. So the randomized control results are through 54 months, and then the follow-ups are at those ages. And I'll talk a little bit about all of those things as we go. So I'm going to be talking mostly about 54 months, 12, and 16, but I will mention 8 a little bit. Okay. So this is an important thing to remind us of. Chuck mentioned yesterday that we're using intent to treat analysis, which means whatever group the child was originally assigned to, that's the group the child is analyzed in. So this is the care as usual group. These are kids who were abandoned at birth, placed in institutions in Romania, and then whatever happened to them based on Romanian practices over the period of time of the study, that's what happened to them. So these darker bars here, the brown bars, are the percentage of children living in institutions. So obviously at baseline, it's 100%. And then at 30, 42, 54, 8, 12, and 16, you can see that the size of the brown bar goes down. So those children, even in care as usual, by the time they're 4.5 years old, 54 months, the majority of them are living in families. That's because some of them got returned to the families that had abandoned them, some of them got adopted within Romania, and some of them were placed into government foster homes that didn't exist at the time that the study began. Nevertheless, even though all those different things happened, they remain our care as usual group. So the important thing for you to remember is that any comparisons between the care as usual group and the foster care group are conservative estimates of the effect of the intervention because we're not just comparing to children who are actually living in institutions. Make sense? Everybody's with me? Okay. How do we assess psychopathology? These are very young children. So we use structured psychiatric interviews that ask in great detail about the presence or absence of symptoms, about the frequency, about when they first appeared, about how debilitating these symptoms are. The measure that we used when the children were 54 months of age was something called the PAPA, the Preschool Age Psychiatric Assessment. And then when the children were 12 and 16, we used the DISC, which is just another structured psychiatric interview to ask about symptoms and disorders and impairment. I'm going to be reporting 4 types of disorders, internalizing disorders, and all I mean by that is anxiety and depression. These are emotional problems, anxiety and depression. We're calling them internalizing disorders. And for externalizing disorders, I'm talking about oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder, basically aggressive behavior problems. And the next type of disorder that I'm going to report on is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, typically known as ADHD. By the time the children are age 16, we had children who were beginning to engage in substance use. And so at age 16, I will be reporting something about substance use disorders as well. The first thing I want to do is just briefly mention, we've talked about this a little bit, the mental health outcomes, psychopathology, at the conclusion of the randomized trial, which, as we said, was 54 months of age. And basically what we found was significantly more impairing mental health problems in 4.5-year-old children who were randomized to the care as usual group compared to children living in families. Even though you remember, at 54 months, more than half of the care as usual group were actually living in families. So significant differences in the number of psychiatric problems. Fewer psychiatric symptoms, fewer psychiatric disorders, and less impairment. On the other hand, this was primarily accounted for by less anxiety and depression in girls. So the biggest effect was in girls, and the biggest effect was in internalizing disorders. Now, we were interested in, so why would being placed in foster care lead to reductions in psychiatric symptoms? So here we have a diagram that shows that whether you were at 22 months of age on average, randomized to foster care or to care as usual, led to reductions in anxiety and depression in girls at 54 months of age. So one of the things we wanted to look at was attachment security. Attachment security was assessed at 42 months of age. So randomization at 22 months, attachment security at 42 months, and then our outcome at 54 months. And statistically, it's possible to say, okay, is this effect of the intervention on anxiety and depression at 54 months a direct effect? Is it because of this randomization, or does an indirect path through security of attachment explain the outcome? And the answer is the indirect effect does. So this gives us some insight into the mechanism by which foster care reduces psychopathology. To the extent that children formed secure attachments to their caregivers at 42 months, that led to reductions in psychiatric symptomatology at 54 months of age. Okay? Similarly, we looked at caregiving quality at 30 months of age by conducting observations, that were videotaped and recorded and then coded by coders who knew nothing about the study, didn't know what they were just assessing the quality of care that the caregivers were providing at 30 months of age, wherever the children were, whatever their setting was. And we're looking at a bunch of outcomes at 54 months of age: indiscriminate behavior, reactive attachment disorder, and anxiety and depression or internalizing disorders. And we find basically the same thing, that it is mediated through security of attachment. So the way that the caregiving quality that the children received early led to reductions in these psychiatric problems was through security of attachment. So again, to the degree that the children formed secure attachments, that led to reductions in psychopathology later. Because there were very significant differences in the proportion of children who were in foster care placements who had secure attachments and the number of children who were in the institutional setting who had secure attachments. Everybody with me? Yeah? Okay. So now I'm going to move ahead 8 years, and we're going to look at the children at age 12 years. So this is now 8 years after the conclusion of the randomized controlled trial. And remember, we've turned over the foster care networks to the local authorities, and so they've run them however they run them. And in some cases, the children are in the same stable placements that they'd been in some cases, they had gone on to other things, and some of them, again, had been returned to their parents. Some of them had gone into government foster care. Many things had happened over the intervening 8 years. But the first thing that we did was we just looked at a comparison of the community kids who'd never been institutionalized. That's the the orange bars here, and the children who'd ever been in institutions. So we're lumping together the foster care group and the care as usual group. And what you see is significantly more psychiatric disorders, nearly 40% in the group who had ever been exposed to institutional rearing, and only about 15% in the group who were community kids. No differences in internalizing disorders, but very large differences in externalizing disorders, aggressive behavior disorders, and very large differences in ADHD in the children exposed to institutional rearing compared to the children who had always been raised in families. Those are just the significant differences. Okay, so the next thing that we did was looked at a comparison of children who were originally randomized to foster care versus those who were originally assigned to care as usual. And remember, lots of things have happened to those two groups over time. And what we find looking at externalizing signs, that is, symptoms of externalizing disorders, so just tallying up numbers of symptoms, we find significantly more in the care as usual boys compared to the foster care boys, who have significantly more than the never institutionalized community boys. So you get this kind of stepwise pattern that you've seen before, where the care as usual kids have the most problematic outcomes. Foster care kids are better, but not quite at the same degree as the never institutionalized kids. So one of the things that has been reported in children exposed to institutional rearing, this is in the literature, is something called callous unemotional traits. Callous unemotional traits refer to lack of guilt, lack of empathy, lack of response to distress in others, and it's believed to be a set of characteristics that are predictive of antisocial personality disorder in adulthood. Doesn't mean that every child with elevated callous unemotional traits will become an antisocial personality disordered adult, but the risk is very substantial. So we looked at callous unemotional traits in the children at 12 years of age. And children with histories of institutional rearing had elevated callous unemotional traits compared to the community kids. The callous unemotional traits were significantly reduced for boys who were randomized to foster care compared to boys who were in care as usual. So at 12 years of age, reductions in callous unemotional traits for boys, no difference in girls, but the girls were pretty low. They didn't have large elevations in callous unemotional traits. But a significant difference for boys, depending on whether or not when they were 2 years old, they were randomized to foster care or randomized to usual care in the institutions. And we were curious about what the mechanism for that might be, because there's a lot of literature that would suggest that these callous unemotional traits are pretty impervious to experience. They may be highly heritable and unaffected by subsequent experience. But what we found, we looked at caregiver interactions that were observed, again, videotaped, observed, and coded at 42 months of age, so when the children were very young. And we looked at the warmth of caregiver responses to children and their responsiveness to distress. How responsive were they when the children were distressed? And what we found was that the response to distress is what explained the reduction in callous unemotional traits in 12-year-old boys in foster care. So the reason that the boys in foster care had less callous unemotional traits is because their foster parents were more likely to respond to distress than the caregivers of the children in care as usual, many of whom were institutional caregivers. So another thing that has been reported in the literature to be a real problem in institutionalized children is attachment disorders. So what you're looking at here is signs of reactive attachment disorder. And the brown line at the top are kids in the care as usual group. The orange line that begins very high and then drops down is the foster care group. And the black line across the bottom is the community kids who are never institutionalized. So what this shows is that the institutionalized kids had elevated signs of reactive attachment disorder back at baseline, and then at every assessment point after that, 30 months, 42 months, 54 months, age 8, age 12, the children randomized to foster care had very substantial reductions, and in fact were indistinguishable from the never institutionalized community children. Whereas there is a kind of decline in the care as usual, it remains significantly higher than the other two groups. And that decline is accounted for completely by children in the care as usual group who were placed into families. So if we had shown you the line of the children who remained in institutions, that line wouldn't diminish at all. It would be flat across the screen. So reactive attachment disorder is something that is very sensitive to care in families as opposed to care in institutions. Okay, so the next type of attachment disorder is disinhibited social engagement disorder. We have the same three groups. Dark brown is care as usual, orange is foster care, and black is the community kids. Here the story is somewhat different. There's a reduction in both the care as usual and the foster care kids, but the difference is not nearly as dramatic as we saw with reactive attachment disorder. There's still a significant difference at age 12, less signs of social disinhibition in the 12-year-olds who were assigned to foster care, but they're still elevated compared to the community kids. And if you're familiar with the literature on children who are adopted internationally, intercountry, out of institutions, you know that one of the most persistent signs in those children, in addition to ADHD, is indiscriminate behavior. We don't really understand why some kids continue to show persistence of disinhibited social engagement disorder even after they're placed in loving, caring families, and why other kids, those signs diminish. We haven't really solved that problem yet. And so our findings are reflective, basically, of what the literature would suggest. Okay, so as I said, lots of things happened to these children over time. And as Chuck mentioned a few minutes ago, the foster care group at age 12, some of those kids were in their original foster placement, and others ended up with one or more placement changes, which we call disruptions. So by age 12, we had 28 of the original group of foster care children who had had one or more changes in placement, and 26 who were in the original foster family where they had been placed. And so we wanted to look at the effects of disrupted versus stable foster care on the children's psychiatric status at 12 years of age. So now we're going to have 4 groups. We're going to have the care as usual group, the foster care disrupted group, and the foster care stable group, and the community group. And we're particularly interested, just for this analysis, in whether or not there are differences in the group of children who disrupted and the group of children who remain stable. So, at age 12, when we look at signs of internalizing disorder, so this is anxiety and depression, what we find is elevations in anxiety and depression in the disrupted group and significantly lower levels of anxiety and depression in the stable group. Children with reactive attachment disorder are children who are withdrawn, unresponsive, don't seek comfort when they're distressed. If they get distressed, they just sit there and experience distress, but they don't look to adults to make them feel better. These are children, in essence, who lack attachment to anyone. They have no attachment to anyone, and the way that that manifests is reductions in positive emotional expression. They don't look very happy, and when they're distressed, they don't know that another human being can make them feel better and comfort them. And this is something that's been in the literature about children raised in institutions for 75 years now. This has been well described. Disinhibited social engagement disorder describes kids who aren't withdrawn at all. They're, if anything, overly friendly, except that it doesn't feel friendly. They violate personal space, personal boundary. They get too close. They're too touchy. When they're older, they ask overly intrusive personal questions of people they don't even know. And they seem too comfortable with unfamiliar people. So around 7 to 9 months of age in a typically developing child, they develop something that's called stranger wariness or stranger anxiety. And that means that whereas before, at 6 months, they were perfectly happy to interact happily with anyone, even people they've never seen before, after 7 to 9 months, they develop a reticence about unfamiliar people. And some babies, there's a big range of how they react, from just a little bit of hesitation or caution to some babies who burst into tears when strangers try to interact with them. and they don't seem to read and understand social boundaries in the way that typically developing children do. So children are more touchy than adults, but even young children aren't supposed to go up to a stranger in the park and jump in their lap and happily wander off with them. Children who do that have this disorder called disinhibited social engagement disorder. So everybody understands about stable versus disrupted, right? Okay. So here we have a big difference within the foster care group based on whether or not they were with their original families or not with regard to internalizing disorders. Now, when we look at externalizing disorders, it turns out there's a big difference in boys and girls. Oops, sorry. For girls, very substantial reductions in aggressive behavior problems, substantial reductions in that for the children who were in their stable placements versus those who experienced disruptions. Where for the boys, whether it was stable or not doesn't seem to matter, but the foster care groups, these two in the middle here, are significantly lower than the care as usual group. So for boys, it's just foster care. For girls, it matters whether or not it's the original stable placement. Now, here's the question. Nathan was giving you a quiz earlier. I'll give you a quiz now. So for children who are having significant psychiatric symptomatology, they must be more likely to cause a placement disruption because of the difficulty of their behavior, and the foster parents say, we don't want to deal with this child, we want him out of our home, and so that gets disrupted. So how do we know whether it's the disruption that causes the symptomatology or the symptomatology that causes the disruption, right? So I wish I could prove to you which it is. I can't, but I can suggest to you that it's the disruptions that cause the symptoms rather than the other way around. So the way we address this is we went back to 54 months when we assessed the children at the end of the trial, and we compared the children who were going to disrupt later to the children who were not going to disrupt later. And we found 0 differences at 54 months. No more psychopathology, no differences in IQ, no differences in anything that we could come up with to compare. So that doesn't prove what I said, but it's strongly suggestive evidence that it's disruptions that cause problems rather than problems that cause. Now, both things happen. I'm not saying both things don't happen. But the most important direction of effects is disruptions causing symptoms. Okay? So now we're moving on to age 16. And at age 16, what we find is that, again, comparing the children who'd ever been exposed to institutional rearing to the children who'd never been exposed, more than half of the children who had ever been exposed to institutional rearing have a diagnosable psychiatric disorder, more than half, at 16 years of age. Whereas only about 15%, which is what worldwide prevalence rates would suggest, in the community kids who've never been institutionalized. No differences in internalizing, very substantial differences of 3 times greater risk for aggressive behavior disorders, and a very substantially increased risk for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Okay? Now, to assess the effects of the intervention, here we're comparing the care as usual group to the foster care group, care as usual in orange, foster care in brown, and we find differences in diagnosis, so more than 60% of the care as usual kids have a psychiatric diagnosis at age 16. About 38% of the foster care group have a psychiatric diagnosis at age 16. A substantial difference is in internalizing disorders, anxiety disorders, or depressive disorders. A almost significant difference in externalizing disorders, aggressive behavior problems, and no differences in ADHD. So at age 16, we're interested in the same thing as before. We want to look at stability. And so we are going to compare the care as usual group to the foster care group who've experienced disruptions, to the foster care group who remain stable, to the community group. And what we find is, if you look at any diagnosis, look at the yellow bar and the brown bar. 55% of the kids who had experienced a disruption by age 16 had a diagnosable psychiatric disorder. Only 19% of the kids in their original stable placement at age 16 had a psychiatric disorder. So the kids who had experienced a disruption looked very much like the care as usual group, and the kids who had not experienced a disruption looked very much like the community never institutionalized group. For internalizing, you can see that the difference is fully explained by foster care. The yellow and the brown are much lower than the orange. For externalizing, you get this kind of stepwise function where there's a reduction for kids in disrupted foster care compared to care as usual, and then another drop for kids in stable, and another drop for the community kids. And again, for ADHD, that difference, although it looks impressive, was not statistically significant for stable and disrupted foster care. If we look at total psychiatric symptoms, just totaling up the number of symptoms, you can see the care as usual group at almost 11, the kids who had disrupted placements at almost 9, the kids in stable placements at about 5.5, and the community kids at about 2. So this is just group averages over time. So again, a big effect of stable placements over time. And here's a way of looking at the data longitudinally. So this is age 8 is the first point, age 16 is the second point. The very top line is the care as usual. You see very little drop in their overall psychopathology from age 8 to age 16. The unstable foster care look a little bit lower, but they're also, it's almost a flat line. That's the purple group. Whereas the red group in stable foster care has a very substantial reduction between 8 years of age and age 16. And the green bar is the community kids. Okay? All right. So basically, foster care reduces psychopathology very substantially, even for children who've already experienced, on average, nearly 2 years of deprivation. And stability of those foster care placements seems to play an extremely important role in reducing psychopathology. And this is extremely important for the child protection world to understand, that moving kids from one place to another increases their risk for significant problems. That stability is really important to factor into the equation. Okay, so now I would like to talk about competence. And we've done all these analyses and we have all these variables, but at some point we decided we really wanted to know about individual children. And one of the ways to look at individual children was to say, at age 12, what does a competent 12-year-old look like? And so based on our measures, we said, well, a competent 12-year-old should have reasonable family relations, reasonable peer relations, should be functioning okay in school, you know, getting by, not in special placements or anything like that. Should be reasonably healthy physically, should not have a lot of impairments from psychopathology, from psychiatric problems, should not be using tobacco and alcohol, and should not be engaging in lots of risk-taking behavior. So these were areas that we had measures in and we could assess. And we defined competent as children who were competent, deemed competent in 6 out of 7 of these. So we said, okay, one area they could have a problem, but 6 out of 7, we're going to call them competent. And for each of the 6, the typical way that we determined whether or not they were competent was we compared them to the typically developing community kids. And if they were within a standard deviation, which Nathan earlier pointed out is 15, you know, within 15% of the community kids, then we said, okay, we're going to call that competent because there's not even a standard deviation of difference between them on these variables and these community kids. Okay, so when we do that, what we found was that 85% of the community kids were deemed competent by that definition. That's not surprising. That's exactly what we'd expect. But only 36% of the kids who had been raised in institutions were deemed competent at that point in time. Then when we compared children in the care as usual group, which is over on the left, we found only 22% were competent at age 12. 78% did not attain the level of competence. Whereas for the foster care kids, almost half attained a level of competence. So, or just over half, sorry. So basically what you see is more than 2 times likely that children in foster care will be competent compared to children in care as usual. And in keeping with what Nathan was talking about earlier, we looked at within the foster care kids, whether they were placed before 20 months of age or after 20 months of age. And nearly 3/4 of the kids who were placed prior to 20 months of age into families, into foster care families, were deemed competent, whereas fewer than half of those placed after 20 months of age were deemed competent. So this reminds me to add a qualification to everything the 3 of us have said today. Do not leave this meeting thinking that there is a particular age at which it is no longer possible for children to recover. That is not what our data suggests. What our data, taken in the context of all the data of similar studies that have looked at these questions, is the sooner the child gets into an adequate caregiving environment, the better they're going to do. The longer you wait, Chuck's example of trying to push against the door, the longer you wait, the harder it is. It is impossible for us to make predictions about individual children. All we can talk about is that as a group, the general principle is the sooner kids can get into adequate caregiving environments, the better they will do. Okay? All right. So we had these interesting results at age 12, and we said, well, geez, we could go back and look at this at age 8, and now we have 16-year-old data, so we could look at it at age 16. The only difference is that at age 8, none of the kids were using substances, and so it didn't really make sense to include that. So at age 8, we're saying 5 out of 6 domains, if you're competent, you're going to be deemed overall competent. And at 12 and 16, 6 out of 7, and we're going to deem that you are competent. And here we find, so we end up with kids who are consistently competent, which means 8, 12, and 16, kids who are never competent, which means not competent at 8, 12, or 16, and then this middle group who are competent at 1 or 2 ages but not competent at all ages, the inconsistently competent. And here we're looking again at a timing effect. Within the foster care group, the kids who were placed prior to 20 months of age compared to the kids who were placed after 20 months of age, and we find that the kids placed early were significantly more likely to be consistently competent at every age and significantly less likely to never be competent at any of those ages. So again, it's just another finding about earlier placement seems to matter. So for the last comparison, I'm just going to compare the consistently competent to the never competent. I'm not going to deal with the inconsistent in the middle. And here we find that of the foster care kids, 26% are consistently competent at every age, so just over a quarter. Only 6% of the care as usual kids were consistently competent. So what is that, a 4 times greater risk for risk of not being consistently competent for the kids who did not go into foster care. Institutional rearing increased risk for serious psychopathology and developmental abnormalities. Recovery is enhanced by several factors that are important for us to pay attention to. And I don't know why these are coming in backwards, so I'm just going to go ahead and get them up there. Earlier placement into families, placement into high-quality foster care, and the higher the quality, the better. And then stability of the placements over time. Now, clearly there may be long-term interpersonal problems that are not accounted for by the measures that we're using, but the data that we have are pretty consistent about what are the critical ingredients in preventing long-term psychological problems and psychiatric morbidity in these kids. So on that, I will stop and thank you very much for your attention.